Chapter 7, Part 2. The displaced person camp could be a desperately sad place for most of the time, but occasionally there were pockets of joy. The people who approached the building tended to do so with an air of resignation. Few people were ever reunited with family or friends. Most of the time, the best they could hope for was closure. Each day, dozens of names appeared on our register of those recorded as entering the camps. They were almost certainly dead, but the lack of anything concrete or final left anyone searching for their loved ones still fresh with a sliver of hope. Deep down, though, they knew. They feared the worst. They tried to come to terms with the worst, and yet, on occasion, that hope was rewarded. Ernie worked ever so hard to keep that light burning for them. We did have a system of checking, registers, lists, files, all linked to places, establishments, prisons, factories, and any type of record you can imagine. We collated family trees and collected any type of identification documents we could lay our hands on, from birth certificates to school records. But 99% of the time our efforts would just be futile. But systems were in place there to help. We would give those inquiring any information we had and wish them well with their search. Even a negative outcome was a sort of result, closure, and a chance to move on. Ernie, though, would do over and above his expected duty. He would carry out extra checks. He would go and speak to the families away from the DPC. He would travel to other towns to try and track down individuals to support those unable to do so on their own, the old, the sick, or vulnerable. More often than not, his extra efforts would go unrewarded, but occasionally they bore fruit. Those occasions were memorable. I recall one time Ernie travelled to Frankfurt to visit a hospital where an old Jewish lady had worked before the war. Her daughter had approached the DPC with the faint hope of finding a trace of her, but to no avail. Ernie had talked with her about her mother's life before the war, and she shared memories about those happier days. He asked about where she worked and where she lived. He made notes and records that the DPC simply didn't have. And on his next weekend off, he travelled nearly 400 kilometres south to Frankfurt on the hunt for somebody else's mother who was presumed dead. He visited the hospital and found her record there. He located her old address. He spoke to the new residents. They didn't remember her, but the neighbours did. They not only remembered her, but had received a letter from her after the war had ended. The letter indicated she was trying to find information about the whereabouts of her daughter. The neighbours had written back explaining that they were unable to help, but they still had an address. And the address was in Cologne, so you can guess where Ernie went next. She could not be found at that address. She had moved only weeks before, but then he was able to find her new address from the landlord who lived in the above flat. He spent most of that weekend travelling hundreds of miles on a wild goose chase for somebody he didn't even know. He found her, though. I can only imagine the joy on the face when he told her daughter she was alive and well, and had been searching for her too. He returned to the DPC late on the Sunday night with the news. He was exhausted, but absolutely thrilled. And I was there when he told the daughter. She broke down in tears at the news. She fell on the floor in front of us and sobbed and sobbed. Ernie sat on the floor with her and held her. He was in tears too. I think I was. I think we all were. The pair of them were reunited a day or two later at the DPC, and their embrace was incredible, something I'll never forget. I can't even put it into words. They must have held each other without any words for 10 minutes. A family reunited, a love reunited, hope made possible. It was Ernie that made it possible. And this wasn't just an isolated case. Even after DPC intervention and support on many occasions, against all the odds, Ernie brought together dozens of families and friends, giving up countless hours of his own time for the cause. I should have done more, and I know I should. We all should. We did help, and we did bring solace to many. But Ernie was special. He didn't seek reward or recognition, ever. He only wanted to help, to do all he could. His reward was seeing the joy and the relief in others, and to think, if fate had been crueler, he wouldn't have even reached Bergen-Belsen in the first place. He was lucky to be alive himself. Again, I was jolted back to reality. I'd been lost in Daniel's story. A million thoughts had gone through my mind as he was speaking. Would I have done the same as Ernie? Probably not. I would like to think I would have done. I would like to think I would have been so thoughtful and dedicated, but deep down I knew I wouldn't have. If I had my time again. Before I had time to ask any of the questions going through my head, Daniel answered them for me. Before this, during his teenage years, around his 14th birthday, Ernie had fallen ill. By all accounts, he'd always been a fit and sporty child, but he'd developed a cough and he couldn't shake it off. He'd gone off his food and developed terrible headaches and pains, and he was constantly weary. He would often fall asleep at his desk at school or double up in pain, coughing up thick globules of phlegm. The doctor had been very quick to identify the symptoms and diagnose consumption, or tuberculosis, TB. According to his dad, David, Ernie lost nearly 3 stone in weight very quickly, a huge amount for one so young. The boy was wasting away. He was dying. Such a worry for David and Mabel. In the 1930s and 40s, TB was greatly feared. The cure was still in its infancy, and many sufferers did not survive. How Ernie had caught the illness was never established. Ernie told me one doctor attributed it to the animals on the farm, but others dismissed that diagnosis. Either way, at that time the first stage was to quarantine. Ernie was sent to a sanatorium near Seaham in County Durham. He was away from home for over 2 years, and for a family-orientated teen, this illness and isolation must have been awful. He was not permitted any visitors for the first 6 months, and after that even, visits were restricted for everyone's benefit, according to the chief of staff there. His condition worsened in the first year in the facility, and it had been touch and go whether or not he would pull through. On 2 of the visits David and Mabel made to the sanatorium to see Ernie, they had been accompanied by a priest in case the last rites had been needed. So you can imagine the state he must have been in. And yet, in spite of all of this, Ernie still talked about his time with some fondness. The kind staff, the chance to learn and read more, the stunning seaside views. A few positives in a whole pile of negatives. Of course, he craved home, but the one thing the experience gave him was a love of life and a will to live, and to make the most of his time on earth. It was in Seaham that he started to look at life further afield. He probably learned all about events in Europe at this time, more than politicians and government officials. He had a thirst for knowledge, whatever it was, and was fascinated in everything, wanting to learn from others what he couldn't find out for himself through reading. Ernie was an academic, but also very practical. As he recovered and regained his strength and physique, he volunteered for more and more. He helped in the library and the local school. He formed friendships with charity workers and supported local sports clubs and services, raising money through fundraising events. It was around this time he tried to repay the hospital in his own small way by doing volunteer work for them. He trained in first aid and basic care. He helped in the old folks' home and did what he could for others within the sanatorium, such as the disabled or mentally ill. How he crammed it all in, I will never know. I didn't learn much about this time from Ernie himself, I must admit. The stories came from his parents and the dozens of thank you letters he received back at the farm after his return home to Cumbria. David and Mabel showed me them when I first moved there. Ernie never really talked about his time there, as was typical of him, but others had plenty to say. Apparently, he has a plaque or a bench or a tree in his honour every 50 yards down the main street in Seaham. One letter even suggested he should have a bloody statue in the town centre. It made me laugh when I read it, but only because I agreed with the sentiments. He deserved a statue in Bergen too. He was held in such high regard. I don't know what he did when he was in Seaham, but whatever it was, it must have been very special to receive so many accolades and such praise. Ernest was nearly 16 when he returned home, still the same boy who had left the sanatorium in an ambulance. Fitter, wiser, cleverer, and more worldly wise, but still the same boy. His heart was as strong as it ever was, and his good nature could not be killed off, just like his will to battle on. His parents were delighted to have him home, of course. They were ever so proud of him. He continued to work on the farm and support them, but physically he was just not the same and couldn't cope with the labour. This was understandable and to be expected. David was very protective of him and brought in a farmhand to take on many of the chores. The whole community was on hand to help. Everyone around here seemed to be made of the same stock. They didn't have much, but what they did have they were willing to share. Time is worth more than money. David and Mabel were never social animals. They kept themselves to themselves, but I know they had received lots of messages from the villagers over this time, and they really appreciated that support. Ernie had a further period of isolation on the farm. He rarely ventured out. It was probably a case of his parents being overprotective, but all of this had an effect on him, I'm sure. I think he was ready to fly the nest after that. He was so keen to try something new and see the world. David and Mabel, I suppose, recognised this. Prospect didn't offer many prospects for the young Ernie to continue with the good deeds he had become known for in Seaham. He loved his parents dearly, and they loved him, but they knew he was keen to leave when he was fit and able again, and have adventures beyond Cumbria. I just don't think they expected him to end up in Germany. And so, back to Belsen and how we got where we are today.